As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. Welcome to the first episode of my season of Summer Shorts, a series of short, sweet episodes where you'll hear from writers working in the trenches right alongside you. Each week, they'll share their fears, doubts, and questions they have about the craft of writing and the writing life. Consider it your backstage pass to my coaching practice. This week, you'll hear from Camp Structure alumni Shoshana Koch, a psychologist, writer, and speaker who's working on a coming-of-age memoir. During this episode, we explore the challenges trauma survivors face when building an author platform, how to deal with rejection, and how to re-engage with a writing project after you've had to let it go. But before we get to our conversation, I have a few questions for you. What struggles do you face when developing your author platform? Which ones feel especially difficult? Have you ever set a project aside due to a loss or major change in your life? How did you make this decision? What feelings do you have about re-engaging with it now? I hope you'll ponder these questions as you listen along. Now let's get to my conversation with Shoshana Koch. Hey writers, have you written a draft or two of a memoir only to feel completely lost? Do you wonder what the story really is or how to structure it? Or have you received competing advice from some people who love certain parts of your story while others don't? Or worst of all, have you been ghosted by agents and editors or received the cryptic, great writing but just not for us email? Most writers think the answer is diving deeply into their pages. But to figure out what's missing, what needs to be retooled, and what needs to be tossed, you need a bird's eye view of your manuscript. That's what I'll provide in Camp Structure, my proven program that will help you understand how stories work, decide what parts of your life actually belong in your book, and develop a clear path through the revision landmines most memoirists face. As a member of Camp Structure, you'll benefit from expert coaching, membership in a motivated cohort, monthly Ask Me Anything office hours, and instruction that will help you finish this book and the next one. So if you want to feel confident about the story you're telling, clarity around how to write it, and the focus needed to get the job done, sign up for Camp Structure by clicking on the link in the show notes. Camp begins on Tuesday, September 10th, which will be here before you know it, so be sure to grab your spot. Why, hello there, Shoshana. I am so glad that you are here today on the Writing Your Resilience podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.
So we have been working together for a period of time, and I am so honored to have you here today because you have some questions that I know other people are also wrestling with. Would you like to share one of those questions?
Yes, I am curious about how you would advise somebody or support somebody knowing that we have to lean into building an author platform, namely a literary portfolio, a literary resume of companion, adjacent personal essays, smaller pieces to our manuscript, the book that we one day hope and intend to publish. How one navigates that process, which is a necessary process, with a background of significant pervasive trauma, complex trauma, in which invisibility played a significant role in terms of neglect and erasure and dehumanization.
Yeah.
How does one continue to pitch and receive a significant portion of rejections as well as silence amidst the sprinklings of acceptance and how not to be mired in that? Yeah.
Such a great question because all writers struggle with rejection in the process of getting their work out there. And, we're told this is what we're supposed to do. And so figuring out, the what, the when, and how to navigate the process is so, so, so important. So, I want to talk in generalities first about struggles that writers often have, especially if they have a trauma history. So, one of the first things that they struggle with is being seen, right? So, if you have had experiences in your life where either you were seen and dangerous things happen or bad things happen, or you weren't seen, and that was a pain point, the process of putting your work out there, just even trying, can be so vulnerable and not just vulnerable, painful. I mean, just absolutely painful. And my heart is just connecting with yours because as a fellow trauma survivor, I have experienced that so many times. And so that is one area that we can really struggle with. Another thing we can struggle with is not just the act of putting ourselves out there, but what the hell we put out there. Because trauma survivors, and I know because you have clinical training in trauma, I mean, that's one of the gifts that you bring to the table, is that trauma survivors can struggle with boundaries, either sharing too much and then feeling overly vulnerable, or not knowing how to be authentic because keeping everything behind some sort of curtain or mask feels a lot safer. So, figuring that out is also an issue. And then we can get into that all or nothing thinking, especially when we're in the silence. And when you have experienced neglect, and I say you in the general sense, like, all people who've experienced neglect, your mind can become such a bad neighborhood, and you can begin to build all of these stories around what this silence means. And if you are trying to submit to literary publications where you have this long period of silence, oh my gosh, it can be so, so hard to deal with that and to feel like the silence means failure, and that not just is the work bad, but you are bad. We can become we can connect those two things together. Any of that resonating for you?
Yes, absolutely. Particularly the experience of it potentially, if we allow it, to reinforce a sense of brokenness
Mm-hmm.
or not belonging, not having a story worth telling,
Yeah.
even though you know it is. You know it is not only in your heart, but because people like yourself and people acquainted with story and writing and publishing are like, yes, this is
Mm-hmm.
compelling. Yes, keep going. Despite that, you, in the midst of like that silence or the rejections, it can reinforce that fracturedness that is the legacy of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, one of the first things you want to consider is what medium is going to be the best medium for you to share your work. And so, when we think about a portfolio or a platform, it can involve lots of different things. And, Tia Levings, who is one of the guests on the podcast, she doesn't have a lot of publications beyond her memoir. So, her platform is largely Instagram. And she also has this movie that she was in, Shiny Happy People. So your platform can be a lot of different things. You want to think about what brings me joy, where do I feel authentic, and how do I feel safe? Because I think that's the first thing that we want to do so that we can dip our toes in the water of publishing, whatever that is for us. And when it comes to, what kinds of pieces you publish, you might want to think about what is the form that is most comfortable to me. So it could be, I want to start with things that focus on other people. Maybe I'm going to do interviews of other writers, or I'm going to write book reviews, because then I know what I'm doing is in service to others. So it's not so much about me. And
Mm-hmm.
that can be a safe way to begin to develop the tolerance for the discomfort. Maybe op-eds, if you, especially if something feels fully cooked for you and there's a little bit of anger there, you can
Mm-hmm.
use that anger to motivate yourself. And that way, you're not just practicing putting yourself out there with work that is going to feel less sensitive if rejections come in. And let's face it, they come in for all of us. That can be one way to do it. And then you're also developing boundaries on how much do I want to share about my experiences. And that can also be really important to think in these other ways, because a mistake that I often see memoirists doing is thinking that, oh, publication means cut out a portion of my manuscript and send that off to be published.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I know that's not it's definitely not what you're doing at all, because I've seen the beautiful essays that you've been working on. So I know that's the case, but I wanted to send that shout out there because that's something that people
Yeah.
do. So it's about finding work that feels fully cooked for you, and that means it's processed in some way, and also that it's a form that's going to have a high chance of getting out there.
Something you said really resonated, which is that as much as possible, we need to be complete with the work that we're trying to put into the world. That there, this idea of fully cooked. Like, not that we have to have full resolution
Hmm.
100%, because we're always in relationship with it, spirals of healing, all of that. But like
Yes.
that with this idea, there is a sense of cohesion, there's a sense of completion before sending it out.
Absolutely. Especially with your early works, thinking about that idea of writing into the scar rather than the
Hmm.
wound. So be sure
Hmm.
that these early works, especially, and I would say always, because it's a good boundary to have, that you're writing from the scar, not the wound.
Yeah.
In terms of things that are for a public audience, you can, of course, write into the wound if it's
Yeah.
for yourself. So that's one piece. And then there's the piece of what do you do with the silence? And how do you navigate that? One thing that I would say, especially in the beginning, is to lower your expectations. Because I think,
Hmm.
when we first start writing, we're like, writing's fun. It's awesome. People have
Hmm.
told me I'm good at it. Therefore, I'm going to get published. We all have these fantasies. That is just, and of course, we have to have these fantasies. These fantasies are the things that help us keep going. If you
Yeah.
think it's hopeless, why the hell would you do this? Right?
Hmm. In fact, like when you allow yourself to submit or become resigned to that hopelessness or that sense of pointlessness, it's dangerous territory for a writer.
Mhm.
It can stop you in your tracks. I know from personal experience.
Oh, I've had it happen to me a bunch of times
Yeah.
where I've had either a rejection that hurt really badly because I expected a yes, or I just had a bunch of rejections and I was like, this is not fun anymore. So I think those things can definitely happen. And
Yeah.
something that a mentor of mine, Sharon Harrigan, said, this was a few years back, she said, get to 100 rejections. Because
Yeah.
when you do, things will
Hmm.
change. And that sounded like an impossible number at the time, but she was so right. And it's because I
Yes.
didn't just like send out 100 things. I learned from every rejection that I had, and I kept working on my craft. And the more I did that, the more it opened things up to me. Does that mean that I never get rejected? Absolutely not. Every writer,
Hmm.
no matter how talented, gets rejected. It's just part of that. But what you
Yeah.
want to do is, in addition to expecting that rejections are part of the process, not allowing yourself to exist in the silence. And one of the
Hmm.
best ways to do that is to connect with other writers and even set up a situation where you're celebrating the rejections as
Hmm.
something that you are, building up. You're like, yes, I am 10 more towards my
Yep.
100. And that cheering it on reframes it in your mind, and it can help you feel better about that process. And you can
Mhm.
also talk to other writers about their rejections, and not just the celebrations of the ones that they got out there, but really finding out what it's like for other people. That way, you're not thinking that it's just you.
Mhm. Yeah, I love the 100 rejections adage and writerly advice. I've heard that as well. And it's a 2024 goal is to pitch that number of times and, yeah, develop that muscle because it's a muscle.
Absolutely.
Hmm. And also, I think I'm really working on keeping it a distinct parallel process
Hmm.
to the writing, the composition, the editing, the creativity, that this is something else.
Yes.
And they're like running along together, but they are distinct.
Absolutely. It's almost like a second job. It requires a different set of skills, a different mindset, everything. And so I love that you're doing that. That is beautiful because what can happen if we're just focusing on the publication process, or we see that as, the same as our writing process, is that we can experience burnout, and it can suck the joy out of the process or the thing that brings us
Yeah.
so much life.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I think also, obviously sometimes you do legitimately need to continue editing and refining something and getting it in the most polished position and form that it can be. But also sometimes I've been using this mantra, right package, wrong address. Like
Yes, I
there's
love
there's
that.
nothing, there's nothing wrong with what I'm submitting here. This I have worked this to the bone. This is what it is. That was the wrong address. That was not the right home. It did not want to land among that literary magazine or media outlet. Its home is elsewhere, and I have to just keep seeking that.
That is so beautiful. And I love that. Right package, wrong address. Because that
That's
was
right.
the last thing I was going to say is develop some kind of mantra, whatever that is for
Yeah.
you. And this is going to be a quote card, I can already tell, for this episode because it's so good. Yes, you want to really understand that rejection is not about you. There are so many factors that go into it. An editor could have figured out, the theme for their issue, or what they're working on, and what you've created and sent to them is beautiful in and of itself, but it
Yep.
just doesn't fit with everything else they have. Therefore, they have to reject it. And it's a
Yes.
kindness, especially if they don't publish that often, because then you can get your work out somewhere else, possibly faster. So, all of those
Yeah.
things are great strategies to use and to hold on to. And that leads to your second question, which is about the creative process.
Yes, it certainly is. Okay, so question two is, as you know, Lisa, I had to push pause on my manuscript in progress due to a pretty cataclysmic loss
Yeah.
in March of 2023. And so my estranged mother died of her addiction, and the grief and loss around that was protracted and complex.
Yeah.
And one of the things I knew I did not want to do in that grieving was continue to write this memoir in which the trauma bond with my mother is so present. It's
Mm-hmm.
such a core part of that narrative, but I wanted to grieve her in a different way, and I felt that that would interfere with it. So that's when I pivoted and began working on personal essays, these like
Mm-hmm.
companion pieces to the memoir, taking Sue Shapiro's class to learn about pitching to media outlets, like, really trying to develop a different skill set so that I could stay in the game, so
Yeah.
that I could keep writing and not let it go. However, it is 2024. I'm coming up on the 1 year anniversary date of her death, and I do feel in a different place with it. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
the grief is much less raw and acute, and I'm wanting to re-engage with the memoir, but I have reservations and
Mm-hmm.
concerns about what can sometimes feel like going back into the trauma vortex
Yeah.
or tunnel or cave, because it is a narrative that includes a lot of trauma, and I just want to move with intention, and I want to be steady and strong as I re-enter that story and that world.
I just want to honor the depth of that loss. There is no good time to lose a parent. And when those relationships are fraught, when estrangement is involved, it just deepens the sense of loss and it makes it more complicated. There's so many other layers to work through. And you have done a beautiful job showing up to that loss, being with it, and setting boundaries with the writing so that you could do that work and not feel triggered by these other things that you could be working on. And so I love that you did that. And now it's a matter of thinking about, okay, I was away from my project, and this is a project that I've worked on really, really hard, put a lot of
Hmm.
energy into it. So what's next? One thing that I would say, and this is for anyone who is grieving a really intense loss, first year is always really hard.
Yeah.
And the month leading up to the anniversary can be a little unpredictable. So,
Yes.
my first invitation would be don't make any decisions or don't do anything until after that anniversary is over with,
Yeah.
because you want to just make space for whatever that is. And for some people, there's a lot of tension that builds up before the anniversary, and then the anniversary itself is a moment of release and
Hmm.
relaxation. So just allow for that to happen. And then, you know, it sounds like something inside you is saying it's time to re-engage. And so,
Hmm.
first, make sure that that's not a message from your brain like, oh, everybody's working on stuff. I should be too. Like, that's about
Uh-huh.
ego, right? So, make sure it's
Yes.
not that, but that it's like some sense of calling. Because when we've been away from a manuscript, and especially when characters within that manuscript have impacted what's going on in the story, you want to listen to the body.
Hmm.
And you may get to
Hmm.
that time and say, you know what, still not yet, or not at all, and it's time to work on something else. And honor whatever that is. And that if you say like not yet, or even not at all, and that not at all can change, honor the fact that that is your wise self telling you that there's something else to work on. It is not a shutting of the door, it is an opening of the window. You just aren't sure what's there yet. So
Yeah.
be sure that it actually is the time. And then if it is the time, if you have that body knowing, and that body wisdom knowing sense about it is usually a relaxation of the muscles, an exhale. There's usually a lack of tension involved. Tension or justification is a sign that
Mm.
you're not ready. So after you've decided, yes, it's time, the first thing you want to do is ask yourself, has the story I want to tell fundamentally changed? Because
Mm.
when you have a significant loss like this, or any other significant change that takes you away from a manuscript, you're going to have some lessons learned that might clarify or change what you decide that you're going to do. So give yourself permission to shift the narrative if that's what needs to happen. You can stay with the same story, but you don't have to stay with the same story. And in either way, do some journaling before you dive in and say, what have I learned? How has this relationship changed? What
Mm.
wisdom am I now bringing to this experience that I didn't have before? And who am I looking back?
Mhm.
Because that person is different.
Yeah, well, I mean, just from a craft point of view, something that we spoke about was how my capacity to render her character, who's a primary character, with more tenderness
Mm-hmm.
is much stronger now because I'm free of that rage
Yeah.
and the anger that was required to hold the boundary for so long with
Mm-hmm.
her. And that will make for a truer story, yeah, than the way I was depicting that relationship on the page. But I really appreciate the reminder of that 1 year, honoring that full year.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have thought about that. I have thought, you could also wait till the end of March once her
Yeah.
death date passes and you've had that process. Because, yes, due to other losses in my life, I am aware that particularly the time around death anniversaries, and especially the first year,
Yeah.
are yeah, they're just tenuous. You don't know what's going to happen, like you said. They're unpredictable a bit. So just thank you. I appreciate that reminder. That's a very important reminder because I have a bit of a sense of urgency. And part of it is that I've experienced so much loss in my life that I'm like, nothing's guaranteed. I don't know how much longer I'm going to be here. And
Hmm.
there's a part of me that's like, it's, you say you want to write 3 memoirs before you die. You're 42. You better get cracking. Like, these things take a long time. And so I know that that is not a grounded place to make choices from, but it is part of my motivation.
Hmm.
It's that sense of just, you never know. And I'm rereading the Yoga Sutras, and the first one is, and now we start the practice of yoga. It's like an invocation. It's like, now,
Hmm.
if why not? Like, you don't know what's coming, and what's past is gone now. Like, act now. So I have a little bit of that kind of spurring me on, if that makes any sense.
Oh, totally. And I think a common feeling that many writers have is that they are behind. Like, that there's 1,000 things to do out there and I am behind on all of them. And that alone can create urgency. And there is nothing wrong with acting now. But I think taking the right step, that is
Yeah.
always the most important part, and figuring out what that is and checking in with your body, honoring anniversaries, and then, reading your manuscript and asking yourself, what was the mission of this project? Was the mission to
Mhm.
heal me? Was the mission to serve others in some way? Has that
Yeah.
mission changed? And looking at that, and then you can begin to look at the craft of the writing, the perspective you're taking when you're examining this, the question that you're answering, because sometimes the question that drives our first few drafts, which is usually what happened to me, changes
Mhm.
to something else. And a loss can clarify that, or it can make it fuzzy for a while. And either one is right. But just to begin to say, what is the question? How does this serve me in terms of working on this more? And I think that's really important. And I think in your case, because I know your manuscript, there might be some very profound opportunities to shift things inside yourself by working on this more. But I know other people who they've been working on something where there's a lot of high trauma, a lot
Mhm.
of, and when I'm talking about high trauma, I'm talking about writing about situations that when you are working on them, they are activating your nervous system in some way. Right.
Oh
And
God,
so,
yeah.
oh,
It's the worst. I'm
it
like,
is.
we've talked about this. Like, first draft of my memoir, I developed migraines. I got, oh my God, what is it? Shingles the day after I submitted the full manuscript to my mentor. I mean, it's like insane the amount of somatic presentation of the trauma and the ways your whole system can get hijacked by writing those memories. It's,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah.
So, what I would tell anyone is you do not have to keep reliving that experience or those experiences, especially if you don't have a new way to frame them. Because when you're
Sure.
framing them in the same, this is what happened to me way, even if you're trying to make it more beautiful and you're trying to learn the craft of writing, what you're actually teaching your nervous system is to be activated and to stay
Sure.
in that state of hypervigilance and to reinforce the trauma and the pain. And that is not of service to you, and it's not of service to others. So we
Yeah.
are out of time. There is 1,000
Okay.
things we could talk about with this
Yeah.
because it is such wonderful, rich material. What is the last thing
Yeah.
that you would like to say?
Yeah. Well, just that I think a lot of it too is connecting to Dharma, that it's about this is part of what I'm here to do
Yeah.
for others. This is a huge
Hmm.
way that I can be of service to humanity. And that the more I connect to that
Yes.
like higher purpose of the project, of my own creative expression, the more easeful the whole process becomes for me. The sense of urgency even slips away. There's like, I have all the time in the world when I come from that place. Um,
Absolutely.
so I just have to keep remembering that. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
do have all the time in the world. And if you listen to some of the episodes that have already aired, you
Mhm.
will hear over and over again, especially an episode that is coming to my mind right now is Melanie Brooks' episode. The number of times she was rejected, the number of years she had to wait was
Mhm.
absolutely just mind blowing, given her talent and the beauty of her story. But that by waiting, the right moment came about and her work got published. So, and that will
Yeah.
happen for you. Well, thank you so
Yes.
much for being on the
Thank
podcast.
you. A deep bow.
A deep bow right back at you. It was so wonderful to have you here. Are you a writer who struggles with doubts? Do you wonder if your stories are good enough? Do you wish you had some simple tricks that would make the writing life just a little bit easier? Become part of my Writing and Resilience community by signing up for my newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, 5 brain hacks that will supercharge your productivity, creativity, and confidence. The link is in the show notes. That's it for today's episode. Before you leave, I would love your help spreading the word about this podcast. You can do this in a few very simple ways. Click on the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, then leave a 5-star review. You can also let me know what you think or share ideas for the podcast by connecting with me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or through my Writing and Resilience newsletter, which you can have delivered directly to your inbox.